Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be amongst the capital W, capital E in the room, and really creating an environment and culture of intentionality. As the gentleman up at the top had commented, we can't have the rhetoric and we can't have sort of the policy without enforcement conversation without really contextualizing a deeper history that starts way beyond 1933 and continues way after 1968. So it became really important as a design practitioner with experience in city planning and architecture and policy and law to really understand the intersectionality of these macro systems and structures. It isn't a siloed approach that's going to get us to move the momentum. And I want to give a little bit of history and context of why we launched this exhibition in the summer of 2015. I am a proud Bronx native. In 1960, people like my mother, who was a woman of color, or was a woman of color, sadly passed away last year, were in dire need of housing opportunities because of the overcrowding and the conditions that these macro systems create in communities. And people like her end up moving into places like the Bronx because of the white flight that was occurring in our communities. And when she went through these opportunities, of course, they didn't show her places like Levittown that Richard Rothstein had mentioned. They showed her areas because these were areas where contract buyers and blockbusters and predatorial practices were existing to prey upon people who were in dire need, as Ta-Nehisi Coates mentions in his article, The Case for Reparations. So the home here you see on the slide is the home that my mother, when she came to look, that's how it looked. This is a 1940 tax picture of the property. By 1980, this is the house I was growing up in. With no running hot water and a kerosene heater in 3 rooms. People like my mother, who, on the back of people like my mother, I should say, the hope of democracy is built on, didn't have the option to leave. Nor did many of us want to leave. And we then stood on the front lines as a result of these conditions of the worst and most impactful and devastating epidemics this nation has ever seen. Because on the heels of the fires that created a condition where I lost 85% and grew up in rubble of housing stock in my community, came the heroin epidemic. The heroin epidemic, unlike today, which is a public health crisis, was criminalized back then. So people in my family, who were war veterans that served in the Vietnam War, experienced this condition, including my father. On the heels of heroin, we had the AIDS epidemic, which my father succumbed to. On the heels of the AIDS epidemic, we had the crack in our community. And on the heels of crack, we had unprecedented violence that we experienced. And before you know it, there was an unraveling of a social fabric. Communities don't become like this overnight. This is an intentionally designed process. And back to the gentleman's comment. When you look at the timeline, there is something very deeply seated in our community. It's about perception. It's about a hierarchy of value. It's about who we deem to be of value and who we deem to be unvaluable. And it starts back with things as eugenics and scientific racism. And if we don't understand those components, we will never, again, as the man mentioned up above, that we will not move forward. Because there is something in our conscious and subconscious, even with the vernacular that we use today, with describing low-income housing, low-income people, homeless, we are still operating people. Something very profound happened in 2015 that really was the impetus behind this exhibition. I don't know if many of you are familiar with Dr. Mindy Fullilove. Yes. Dr. Mindy Fullilove wrote a book called Root Shock that really talks about the neuroscience and the psychological effect that these conditions have, particularly to people of color. Before Mindy, Kenneth Jackson wrote a book called The Crabgrass Frontier that really delved into this matter. And what we're looking at here is on a trip with Mindy, going to the National Archives as they were doing research for the University of Richmond's Mapping Inequality. If you all haven't seen that tool, it's a great tool that is kind of collecting redlining maps and the area descriptions. Forgive me here. I remember going up with Mindy and we went to pull out the Bronx map. And I remember unfolding with the gloves, because it's the actual map that was around then, and looking, and you immediately go to look for where you live. And I just remember finding my street and seeing this big blotch of red. And for some reason, I was overcome by such grief and emotion that I couldn't stop crying when I saw it. And I said, Dr. Phililov, I don't know who better cry next to than you as a psychiatrist, because I don't know what the hell is going on. I don't know why I'm crying. And she said, because the Rolodex is going in your mind of all the conditions. And I said, yeah, I think what's most painful is people like my mother who had this optimism and hope about the pursuit of happiness and the right to life and liberty was disrupted because of decisions that were made in 1933 unbeknownst to her. So it was the impetus to me that said, I'm in circles where people are master manipulators of our built environment, and many have no clue about this history. How can you even fix your mouth and sit across from me without understanding this history to say how you are going to design and manipulate our built environment? So we decided to do an exhibition that, yes, talks about redlining, but it really expands it much more. And what it says is that, again, if we don't know and understand these deeper systems and structures, there's no way that we can use design as a tool to transform the built environment. And really shift perception. Because perception means when I walk down the street and you're telling me this is a low-income housing unit, and it's embodied by the same people you think of as being low-income, it's going to be problematic. How about we eliminate that vernacular? How about we rebrand how we talk about people? And I think what has been so beneficial is as we travel across the country with this exhibition, it's not my opinion that moves people. It's when people see a redlining map and see the coordinating area description, for example. Can anyone, or can all of you, read what question C is asking here? So question C, this is the surveys that are used to then create the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps. And it's asking what is considered a detrimental influence as they're surveying and autopsying the Bronx. And right after that, you'll see the words Negro infiltration. At this time, ethnicities as Irish, Italian, Jewish, and many others were also considered undesirable, and things that you had to protect against and from. And when I saw this, and when people see this, skin color is made synonymous with othering and devaluing, to the point where you dehumanize someone who looks different from you, to justify the outputs then that you create in the built environment. As Richard mentions in his book, which I've read several times and I've bought 100 copies of to share with everyone and say, read this before we have a conversation. As we do deeper and deeper research, this isn't just about home ownership, because that's a precarious solution to a lot of our conditions in our built environment. We believe in community shared equity. We believe in limited equity cooperatives. We believe in things that don't other and use housing as a commodification to say that if you have this, you can get access to this. That is not democracy. That is not democratic. So what this machine ends up building, as Richard accurately points out, is that it's funded by the federal government. It isn't that racial segregation and zoning did not exist prior to the New Deal. It's that it was billions were invested to create the infrastructure and the geographical footprint of America. And it becomes so profitable and so powerful that it isn't just the Levitt brothers or the Levitt, Mr. Levitt that's saying, we're going to practice restrictive covenants. But it's banks, it's the asphalt industry that builds the highways to the suburbs, it's the rubber industry, it's the automobile industry, it's the real estate industry. This is a quote from a textbook that they used up until 1947, that how they taught their realtors to steer communities. And the quote says, "The colored people certainly have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But they must recognize the economic disturbance which their presence in a white neighborhood causes and forego their desire to split off from the established district where the rest of their race lives." Does that sound like democracy? Does that sound like the land of opportunity that countless have shed blood to protect the ideologies and principles for? No, it does not. So by the time our communities begin looking like this is Jimmy Carter visiting the Bronx when he creates the Community Reinvestment Act to become intentional about redlining. But you just can't, out of a spaceship, drop something and think it's going to change centuries of conditioning and dynamics. And we begin to blame the people there, saying somehow it's their fault. There's something wrong with the DNA of those people. Meanwhile, not understanding the history of why communities even become like this to begin with. So what I'm adding in this whole context as a design practitioner is really understanding the role of design, the role of architects, the role of city planners, the role of city agencies, and understanding what it is that we need to do, because what might work in the Bronx may not work in the streets of Baltimore. How do you create granular disruptive data to understand what the paradigm in the landscape is? So what we have done is, again, we've embarked on this crusade that is much about what Richard was mentioning, educating and building knowledge and understanding of a deeper history. Because in order to move forward, we need to provoke, prod, and conjure up empathy for all human beings. Not empathy for human beings that are this or that, but empathy for everyone. And we are absent of that. There is a moral void in this society. And when Renee mentions the People Campaign, the Poor People's Campaign, and all of these movements, there is a groundswell that's happening that I don't think could have happened before. Because people are tired. People are looking at those historically redlined areas like Newark and the Bronx, that massive investments are coming in, and they're all being celebrated as the next best thing to cherry pie. But they're not understanding the collateral consequences those developments are happening to the people when those areas were pariah zones no one wanted to come into. So we're building housing on land. People were allowed to do land grabs, and it's happening in Patterson right now, because Patterson was mentioned in the Regional Planning Association's report recently, where you can buy land for nothing and make millions off of that land. In the Bronx, a house on Alexander Avenue, which was a hot block with drugs, was sold for $320,000 in 2013. In 2016, it was put back on the market for $1.2 million. Tell me, who is that for? Tell me what is there to celebrate about that when we're just shoving people into the new redlined areas. So the processes is understanding and grounding context. How do we implore a participatory design process that's not stewarded by people who are not from that community, but actually the people who are living in those communities, where they can steward their own data, control their own information, so that when they're invited at the seat of the table, the foreign concepts or the carrot stick is not going to be good enough. Sorry for the distortion of this slide. And our part is, again, partnering. So Richard was speaking about education and what kids are learning. I want to give some what comes out of this work. In Baltimore, the CEO of the school system was so moved by the exhibition that she made it mandatory for every single staff member of the Baltimore City school system to see this exhibit. Not only did she do that, but she is now, we are working with the Baltimore City school system to create a curriculum around this material. And it isn't about just learning the history. It's really a hybrid model of understanding grounding context, but also how do we use design as a tool for transformational change? How do you go into your communities and see the opportunities, not when you're forced out, but while you're there? How can you convert housing there that's going to be accessible for all? How do you use these skills to really create a more just and inclusive human experience? So that's the work, that's an example of the work we're doing. In Trenton, with the Watson Institute for Public Policy, we're working to look at how we redefine land tenure in places like the state of New Jersey. Because if you don't have the land and the land is inaccessible and it becomes too expensive, I don't know how you create equitable housing models. So what started off as a farm and a couple of rows of produce has really expanded and emerged to look at community land tenure models. And when we went into communities and started having this discussion, members were excited about the community land tenure model. They were not excited about an urban farm. And when they understood that there is a potential here to become involved, that was their involvement. So for the law, I was going to say geeks because I'm a design geek, so it's okay. But for the law folks in the room, how do we create land tenure models that really preserve land from a speculative market, that really can compete with real estate investment trusts from foreign investments so that we can do something on that land? So if you're interested in being part of that, because right now Northeastern Law is helping us try to locate local counsel to build a hybrid model that can compete with the real estate investment trust, let me know, because we can start doing something when we leave this room today. Thank you so much.